The mountains of Appalachia are older than human memory. Their mist-shrouded peaks and shadow-filled hollers holding secrets that predate civilization itself. These ancient ridgelines, carved by millennia of wind and rain, have witnessed things that would shatter the sanity of modern minds. Deep in those forgotten valleys, where the mist clings to the mountainsides like the breath of sleeping giants, and where cell phone towers stand useless against the thick canopy of primordial forest, something waits in the darkness between the trees. The locals know they've always known. Their grandparents whispered warnings around dying fires. Their great-grandparents carved protective symbols into cabin doorframes. And their ancestors made pacts with forces that city folk dismiss as superstition. But they don't talk about it. To outsiders, not unless you've proven yourself worthy of their trust. Or unless you've seen it yourself and carry that haunted look in your eyes that marks you as one of the initiated. The tourist bureaus won't tell you about the missing hikers whose bodies are never found. About the abandoned towns where the silence is so complete it feels like a living thing. Or about the old families who still leave offerings at crossroads when the moon is dark. They won't mention the reason why certain trails are mysteriously closed year after year. Or why experienced park rangers refuse overnight assignments in specific sectors. Or why the Cherokee elders still perform cleansing ceremonies for land that was supposedly conquered centuries ago. Tonight, I'm breaking that code of silence that has protected the mountains and the mountains' secrets for generations. These aren't campfire stories crafted to frighten children or urban legends, born from the imagination of bored teenagers. These are testimonies torn from the lips of real people who encountered something that science cannot explain and religion struggles to comprehend. Documented accounts that made grown men abandon their ancestral homes and swear blood oaths never to speak of what they witnessed in those cursed hollers. Some fled to distant cities, others took their secrets to early graves. But precious few are left behind their stories as warnings for those brave or foolish enough to venture into places where the old laws still hold sway. So, turn off your lights, draw your curtains tight, and listen carefully to these tales of terror from the heart of Appalachia, because, after tonight, when you see those misty mountains rising like the spine of some sleeping beast against the horizon, you'll finally understand why the locals warn strangers to stay on the marked trails, to never camp alone, and to always be inside before the sun sets behind those ancient peaks. Story 1. The Bone Lady of Tabitha Mountain. Adam Kelly had lived his entire life in the shadow of Tabitha Mountain, inheriting the small farm from his father and his father before him. But he had never heard the full story of how the mountain got its name until it was far too late to matter. It was November 1952, the kind of bitter mountain winter that seemed to leach the warmth from your bones. When the dying stranger collapsed on his porch in the early hours before dawn, Adam found him there when he stepped outside to check on the livestock. A man he'd never seen before, dressed in clothes that seemed to belong to another era-long black coat that might have been fashionable 50 years earlier. Worn boots that had walked countless miles, and eyes that held the weight of terrible knowledge. The stranger was burning with fever, his breath coming in ragged gasps that misted in the freezing air. And his first words were a desperate plea for a Catholic priest to perform last rites before his soul departed this world. But the nearest Catholic church was 3 counties away, accessible only by treacherous mountain roads that became impassable in winter weather. And even if Adam had been able to make the journey, the stranger was clearly dying, his pulse growing weaker with each labored breath, his skin taking on the waxy pallor that Adam recognized from his father's final hours. By morning, as the pale November sun struggled through the heavy clouds, the stranger was dead. His final words a whispered warning about the lady who collects what is owed, that Adam dismissed as the fevered ramblings of a dying mind. With no identification, no family to contact, and winter closing in fast, Adam made what he thought was the practical decision. He wrapped the body in his wife Sarah's old quilt, and buried the stranger in an unmarked grave behind the barn. Ceremony, beyond a hastily mumbled prayer. No blessing beyond the sign of the cross Adam traced in the air above the freshly turned earth. That night, as Adam and Sarah settled into their bed in the small cabin that had sheltered 3 generations of Kellys, the footsteps started. Heavy, deliberate sounds echoing from the attic above their heads, like a massive horse galloping across the ceiling beams with hooves that seemed to shake the entire structure. Sarah clutched Adam's arm with fingers that dug into his flesh like claws, her face pale in the moonlight streaming through their bedroom window. "That ain't no animal up there," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the thunderous sound of whatever was pacing back and forth in the space above their heads. "Animals don't walk like that, like they got purpose, like they're looking for something." By dawn, they discovered the first sign that their uninvited guest wasn't confined to the attic. 5 chickens lay scattered across the yard, their heads severed clean, as if by a massive scythe, the cuts so precise they seemed almost surgical. No predator, Adam knew, could have made such clean cuts, and no scavenger would have left the bodies untouched while taking only the heads. The footsteps continued every night, growing louder and more insistent, as if whatever walked above them was growing impatient. Then came the scratching, long, grinding sounds against the cabin walls that seemed to circle the entire structure, like bone scraping against wood, in a rhythm that almost sounded like Morse code. Sarah began finding strange symbols carved into the wooden fence posts around their property. Symbols that looked like no alphabet either of them had ever seen, but somehow felt familiar, as if they awakened some ancestral memory buried deep in their DNA. On the 7th night, as Adam lay awake, listening to the relentless pacing above his head, he finally understood what he had awakened with his act of careless burial. The old mountain woman, Granny Caldwell, had tried to warn him when he was just a boy, telling him the story of Tabitha Corwin, the woman for whom the mountain was named a healer and midwife, who had been accused of witchcraft in the 1800s and burned alive by a mob of fearful townspeople, her ashes scattered to the wind without proper burial or blessing. The locals said she had returned as something else, something that demanded proper burial rites for all the dead and punished those who showed disrespect to the departed. They called her the Bone Lady, and she had been waiting in those hills for over a century, collecting debts that the living owed to the dead. The next morning, Adam exhumed the stranger's body and carried it 20 miles to the nearest church, where a traveling preacher agreed to perform a proper burial service, despite the body's deteriorated condition. As soon as the final Amen was spoken and the stranger was laid to rest in consecrated ground, the footsteps stopped. The scratching ceased. The chickens lived through the night unmolested. But the price of Adam's ignorance had been paid in more than just lost sleeps. Hair had turned completely white during those 7 nights of terror, and she never spoke above a whisper again for the rest of her days. Even now, more than 70 years later, hikers on Tabitha Mountain report the sound of hooves echoing through the trees on foggy November nights, and farmers in the surrounding valleys still find their chickens headless in their coops. A reminder that some debts are never truly paid, and the Bone Lady still walks those ancient ridge lines, watching and waiting for the next person foolish enough to deny the dead their proper rest. Story 2. The Watchers in the Pines. Park Ranger Michael Torres had spent 15 years walking the trails of Pocahontas County, West Virginia, and he thought he knew every shadow, every sound, every trick that the ancient forest could play on a man's mind, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for that. October afternoon in 1978, when the forest itself seemed to hold its breath and watch him with 1,000 invisible eyes. Michael was conducting a routine trail inspection on the northern section of the preserve, checking for fallen trees and erosion damage after the previous week's heavy rains. When he first noticed the unusual silence that had settled over the woodland like a suffocating blanket. At first, he attributed it to the approaching weather system. Animals often went quiet before storms, but, as he continued deeper into the pine forest, the silence became something more than absence of sound. It became a presence unto itself, thick and oppressive, as if the very air had solidified around him. No birds sang in the branches overhead. No insects buzzed in the undergrowth. No squirrels chattered their territorial warnings, and even the wind, which should have been moving through the pine needles with its familiar whisper, seemed to have abandoned the forest entirely. It was in this unnatural quiet that Michael first saw them, tall, impossibly thin figures standing motionless between the massive pine trunks, barely visible in the shadows but unmistakably there, like pale scarecrows that had wandered away from some forgotten farm and taken root among the trees. At first, he counted only 3 or 4 of the silent watchers. Their forms, so still they might have been carved from the same pale stone as the limestone cliffs that dotted the region. But as his eyes adjusted to the filtered light of the forest floor, he began to see more of them. Dozens of the creatures standing at perfect intervals throughout the woodland, each one facing directly toward him with an attention so focused it felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. They didn't move when he called out to them, his voice echoing strangely in the oppressive silence, as if the sound was being absorbed by something more than just trees and undergrowth. They didn't react when he raised his flashlight and shined its beam directly at their pale forms, the light seeming to pass through them rather than illuminate any details of their appearance. They simply stood and watched with a patience that felt older than the mountains themselves, older than human memory, older than time. Michael's radio crackled with static when he tried to call for backup. The familiar voices of his colleagues replaced by a sound like wind blowing through empty buildings. But no signal could penetrate whatever presence had settled over this section of forest like a dome of invisible force. When he looked back at the tree line after struggling with his radio for several minutes, there were more of them, many more, their pale forms, now visible in every direction he turned, forming what appeared to be a perfect circle around his position with mathematical precision that spoke of intelligence and purpose rather than random placement. The watchers had moved closer while his attention was divided, though he had neither seen nor heard them approach, and now he could make out more details of their appearance that made his rational mind rebel against what his eyes were reporting. They were humanoid in basic shape, but wrong in every proportion, too tall and too thin, with limbs that seemed to bend at angles that human joints couldn't accommodate. And, though he couldn't make out their faces in the shadows, he had the distinct impression that they had no faces at all, just smooth expanses of pale flesh where features should have been. His heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, Michael turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with none of the woodcraft that 15 years of ranger service had taught him. His only thought to escape the circle of silent watchers that had somehow formed around him without him noticing their approach. He ran for 3 miles straight down the winding mountain trail, branches tearing at his uniform and face, his lungs burning with each desperate breath, his boots slipping on wet leaves and loose stones as he fled from something his mind couldn't process or categorize. Behind him, he could hear nothing, no pursuit, no sound of footsteps following. Nothing but that same oppressive silence that seemed to be chasing him down the mountainside like a living thing. When backup finally found him 2 hours later, he was sitting on a fallen log beside the main road, staring blankly at the forest he had called home for most of his adult life, repeating the same phrase over and over in a voice that had been stripped of all emotion. "They're still watching. They're still watching. They're still watching." The other rangers assumed he had suffered some kind of breakdown, stress, overwork, maybe a mild stroke that had affected his perception, but the medical examination found nothing wrong with Michael Torres except for scratches from his flight through the forest and elevated stress hormones that took weeks to return to normal levels. Michael transferred to a desk job the following week, citing a desire for less fieldwork in his official request, and he never spoke about what he had encountered in those pines to his colleagues or supervisors, maintaining a professional silence that lasted for over 40 years. It wasn't until his deathbed confession in 2019, when cancer had reduced the once robust ranger to a whisper of his former self, that he finally told his daughter the truth about that October afternoon, that some places in the mountains were never meant for human eyes, that some forests were home to things that had been waiting and watching since long before the first European settlers carved their way into Appalachian wilderness, and that the silence he had encountered was not the absence of life but the presence of something so alien to human experience that it existed in the spaces between sounds, between thoughts, between heartbeats. His final words to his daughter were a warning that she carries with her to this day. Stay out of the deep woods when the forest goes quiet. And if you ever see them watching from between the trees, don't try to understand what they are. Run, and don't look back. Because some things in these mountains are still waiting for their turn to inherit the earth. Story 3. The Screaming Bridge of Wiley County. Truck driver Danny Morrison had been hauling freight through the winding mountain roads of Wiley County for over a decade when that sultry summer night in 1985 changed everything he thought he knew about the lonely stretches of highway that snaked through the Appalachian darkness. Danny was making his usual run from Charleston to Bristol, his 18-wheeler loaded with mining equipment, when he approached the old stone bridge that spanned Willow Creek, a structure he'd crossed hundreds of times without giving it a second thought. The bridge was a relic from the 1890s, built from local limestone and narrow enough that two trucks couldn't pass each other safely, but it had stood solid and reliable through decades of heavy traffic and mountain weather. That night was different. From the moment his headlights illuminated the weathered stone arches, as his truck rumbled onto the bridge, the sound of children's voices rose from the darkness beneath the span knot, the happy sounds of kids playing in summer twilight. But screaming, pure terror-filled screaming that seemed to echo off the stone walls with an intensity that made his teeth ache. Danny slammed on his brakes, the air brakes hissing like angry snakes, as his rig shuddered to a stop in the middle of the bridge. He grabbed his flashlight from the cab and climbed down into the humid night air, his boots echoing on the old stones. As he made his way to the edge of the bridge to peer down at Willow Creek below, what he saw made his blood run cold. The creek bed was bone dry, had been for months due to the severe drought that had gripped the region. Nothing but cracked mud and scattered stones where water should have been flowing. But the screaming continued, echoing off the bridge's limestone foundations with a clarity that suggested the voices were coming from inside the stone itself, as if children were trapped within the very walls of the structure. Danny called out, his voice cracking with concern as he shouted down into the darkness, thinking that somehow kids had gotten trapped in a storm drain or crawl space beneath the bridge. But his words were swallowed by the night air and returned only as empty echoes. The screaming intensified as if in response to his voice, becoming more desperate, more urgent, until it sounded like dozens of children crying out in unison for help that would never come. That's when Danny noticed the handprints. Carved into the limestone blocks of the bridge's foundation were dozens, maybe hundreds of small handprints, weathered by decades of mountain weather but still clearly visible in the beam of his flashlight. They covered every accessible surface of the stonework, some tiny enough to belong to toddlers, others the size of 10 or 12-year-old hands, all pressed into the stone as if the children had been trying to claw their way out of the bridge itself. As Danny traced one of the prints with his trembling finger, feeling the rough texture of stone that had been worn smooth by countless small hands, the screaming suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the cries had been, thick and oppressive, as if the very air had become heavy with the weight of unspoken tragedy. In that moment of absolute quiet, Danny heard something else, a sound like dozens of small feet running across the bridge above his head. The patter of children's footsteps moving back and forth across the roadway in a pattern that sounded almost like a game of tag or hide-and-seek. But when he climbed back up to check the bridge deck, there was nothing there except his own truck, sitting empty in the pale moonlight, its diesel engine ticking as it cooled in the mountain air. Danny drove straight to the nearest truck stop and spent the rest of the night in the diner, drinking coffee and trying to convince himself that exhaustion had played tricks on his mind. But the old-timers who gathered there knew better. One grizzled local named Earl Watson finally told him the truth about the Screaming Bridge. It had been built in 1892 over an old children's cemetery, the final resting place of 37 young victims of a diphtheria outbreak that had devastated the Pownton community in 1891. The town fathers, eager to forget the tragedy and move forward with their plans for economic development, had decided that building around the cemetery would be too expensive and time-consuming. Instead, They had simply ordered the construction crew to pour concrete over the headstones and build the bridge foundation directly on top of the graves, sealing the children's remains forever beneath tons of stone and mortar. The handprints, Earl explained, had appeared within weeks of the bridge's completion, and the screaming had started soon after the voices of children who had been denied the peace of proper rest, calling out from their prison of stone for someone to acknowledge their existence and remember their names. Danny never took that route again, choosing instead to add an extra hour to his journey by taking the newer highway that bypassed Wiley County entirely. But other truckers continue to report the same phenomenon on humid summer nights when the air is thick and still, the sound of children crying from beneath the old stone bridge, and the sight of small handprints that appear overnight on the limestone foundations, as if invisible fingers are still trying to claw their way out of a tomb that was built to hide a town's shame and guilt. Story 4. The Shape-Shifting Stranger, Tom and Linda. Harvey had been married for 12 years and had driven thousands of miles together through the back roads of rural America, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for the passenger they picked up on that rain-soaked evening in October 1967, as they made their way through the winding mountain roads of eastern Kentucky. They had always been cautious about hitchhikers, especially in isolated areas where cell phone coverage didn't exist and help could be hours away. But something about the man standing patiently by the roadside in the steady drizzle made them break their usual rule. He appeared completely ordinary at first glance, middle-aged, perhaps 50 or so, wearing a worn denim jacket that had seen better days and carrying a small canvas duffel bag that looked like military surplus. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, as he stood with his thumb extended toward the traffic, and when their headlights illuminated his face, he offered a grateful smile that seemed genuine and harmless. Against their better judgment, and despite Linda's whispered reservations, Tom pulled their Ford station wagon over to the shoulder and rolled down the passenger window. The stranger approached with measured steps, his boots squelching in the muddy gravel, and when he leaned down to speak to them through the window, his voice was pleasant and cultured, with just a trace of the mountain accent they had grown accustomed to during their travels through Appalachia. He explained that his car had broken down about 10 miles back, and that he needed to get to the next town over where his brother lived and could give him a ride to the nearest garage. His story seemed plausible, his manner was polite and respectful, and there was something about his calm demeanor that put them at ease, despite their usual caution. Tom unlocked the doors and the stranger climbed into the back seat, settling himself comfortably behind Linda and expressing his sincere gratitude for their kindness in stopping for him on such a miserable night. For the first few miles, the conversation was exactly what they expected from a stranded traveler: pleasant small talk about the weather, observations about the changing autumn leaves, questions about where they were headed and whether they were familiar with the area. The stranger seemed knowledgeable about local history and geography, sharing interesting anecdotes about various landmarks they passed and demonstrating the kind of familiarity with the region that suggested he was a long-time resident rather than someone just passing through. But Linda began to notice something disturbing about their passenger during those first few minutes of conversation. Every time she glanced at him in the rearview mirror, something seemed slightly off about his reflection, as if she were looking at him through water or heat shimmer that distorted his features just enough to make her feel unsettled. At first, she attributed it to the rain on the rear window, or perhaps the poor lighting from their car's interior dome light. But as they continued down the dark mountain road, the distortion seemed to become more pronounced rather than less noticeable. His face appeared to shift and blur at the edges, like a photograph that had been slightly double exposed, and there were moments when she could have sworn she was looking at a completely different person, entirely someone younger, or older, or with different colored hair, or features that didn't quite match what she remembered from when he had first gotten into their car. She mentioned her concerns to Tom in a whispered conversation when the stranger was looking out the side window at a particularly scenic overlook. But Tom dismissed her observations as a trick of the light and the stress of driving on unfamiliar mountain roads in bad weather. It wasn't until Tom himself glanced back to ask their passenger about directions to his brother's house that both of them realized they had picked up something that was definitely not human. The hitchhiker's face was changing before their eyes, not dramatically like a special effect in a horror movie, but subtly and continuously, as if his features were made of clay being molded by invisible hands. His eyes, which had been brown when he first got into their car, were now completely black, with no visible pupils or irises. Just pools of darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When he smiled in response to Tom's question about directions, his teeth were wrong to many of them, crowded into a mouth that seemed larger than it had been moments before. Each tooth sharp and pointed like a predator's fangs. His voice, when he answered Tom's question, carried an odd echo, as if multiple people were speaking in perfect unison. And underneath the familiar mountain accent was something else, something that didn't sound quite human at all. "You can let me out anywhere along here," the stranger said, with unsettling calm. His voice now layered with harmonics that seemed to vibrate in their bones rather than their ears. "This stretch of road will do just fine for what I need." Tom pulled over immediately, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. Every instinct screaming at him to get this thing out of their car as quickly as possible. The hitchhiker stepped out into the rain with the same measured movements he had used when approaching their vehicle, tipped his hat with old-fashioned politeness, and thanked them again for their kindness. Then he walked calmly into the dense forest that bordered the highway, his form becoming indistinct among the trees within seconds. When Tom and Linda looked back toward the spot where he had disappeared, less than 30 seconds after he had left their car, there was no sign that anyone had ever been there, no footprints in the muddy shoulder, no disturbance in the undergrowth where he had entered the forest, no indication that their encounter had been anything more than a shared hallucination brought on by fatigue and bad weather. They drove straight to the sheriff's office in the next town, their story tumbling out in a confused rush of overlapping details and contradictory observations. But the duty officer who took their statement clearly thought they were either drunk, delusional, or playing some kind of elaborate prank. It wasn't until years later, when they began researching local folklore and legends, that Tom and Linda learned about the Appalachian stories of skinwalkers and shapeshifters that preyed on helpful travelers, entities that could assume human form but couldn't maintain the disguise perfectly, especially when viewed indirectly or in reflective surfaces. The Cherokee had legends about such creatures, beings that existed in the spaces between the human world and the spirit realm, able to take on the appearance of ordinary people but always betraying their true nature. Through small inconsistencies that didn't match their physical form, voices that carried too many harmonics, shadows that moved independently of their bodies, or features that shifted when no one was looking directly at them. Tom and Linda never picked up hitchhikers again, and they took a different route through Kentucky on all their subsequent travels. But they still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, remembering the sound of that echoing voice thanking them for their kindness, and wondering what might have happened if they had driven just a little bit further, before asking their passenger to get out of their car. Story 5. The Moon-Eyed People. Spelunker Rebecca Chen had been exploring cave systems throughout the southeastern United States for over 15 years when she joined the team mapping the unexplored caverns beneath the Cherokee National Forest in March 2003, but nothing in her extensive underground experience had prepared her for the discovery that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the history of human habitation in the Appalachian Mountains. Rebecca was part of a 5-person team of experienced cavers working under a grant from the National Speleological Society to document and map previously unexplored cave networks in the region, using advanced surveying equipment and digital photography to create detailed records of underground formations that had never been seen by modern eyes. The cave system they were exploring had been discovered only recently when a sinkhole opened up during heavy spring rains, revealing an entrance that local Cherokee elders claimed had been sealed deliberately by their ancestors for reasons they were reluctant to discuss. The team had been working for 3 days, methodically mapping the main passages and documenting the spectacular formations of flowstone and calcite crystals. When Rebecca's headlamp illuminated something that shouldn't have existed in a supposedly virgin cave system, carefully constructed stone chambers, primitive but clearly deliberate architecture that had been carved from the living rock with tools and techniques that predated any known Native American construction in the region. The walls of these chambers were covered with symbols that bore no resemblance to Cherokee petroglyphs or any other indigenous writing system. Rebecca had encountered in her academic training characters that seemed to flow and interconnect in patterns that suggested they represented a complete language rather than simple pictographs or decorative motifs. The symbols appeared to have been carved with incredible precision, each line and curve executed with mathematical accuracy that spoke of sophisticated planning and artistic skill. But they had clearly been created centuries ago, perhaps millennia, based on the mineral deposits that had formed over and around them. As Rebecca documented the chambers with her camera, taking detailed photographs of the mysterious symbols and the sophisticated stonework, she began to realize that the architecture suggested a permanent settlement rather than temporary shelter. These weren't simple caves that had been used occasionally by hunting parties or travelers seeking refuge from bad weather, but carefully planned living spaces designed to accommodate a substantial population over extended periods of time. There were areas that appeared to have been used as workshops, with stone surfaces worn smooth by repeated use and circular depressions that might have been used for grinding grain or preparing other foods. Other chambers showed evidence of having been sleeping areas, with raised stone platforms that were sized and positioned for human occupancy, and what appeared to be ventilation shafts that had been carefully engineered to provide fresh air circulation throughout the underground complex. But it was the inhabitants that made Rebecca's blood freeze, and her rational scientific mind struggled to process what her eyes were reporting. As her headlamp beam penetrated deeper into the cave system, she began to see movement in the shadows beyond the reach of her light pale. Almost translucent figures that seemed to glide rather than walk, humanoid in basic shape but wrong in proportions and movement in ways that made her instinctively step backward toward the entrance tunnel. The creatures appeared to be nearly as tall as normal humans, but impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to long for their torsos and heads that were larger than human skulls should be, dominated by oversized eyes that reflected her headlamp beam like the eyes of nocturnal animals. They seemed to be afraid of her artificial light, retreating deeper into the cave system whenever she turned her headlamp directly toward them. But she could hear them moving in the darkness just beyond her vision, their footsteps making no sound on the stone floors, but their presence somehow audible as a subtle disturbance in the cave's natural acoustics. What disturbed her most was that they seemed to be trying to communicate with her, producing sounds that were almost, but not quite, like human speech, whispered syllables, in a language that seemed to use tonal variations and harmonic frequencies that no human throat could produce, words that somehow felt familiar, even though she had never heard anything like them before, as if they were speaking in a tongue that awakened some ancestral memory buried deep in her DNA. Rebecca's teammate, James Whitmore, was working in a parallel passage when he heard her calling for help, her voice echoing through the cave system with an urgency that made him drop his surveying equipment and rush toward her location. But when he arrived at the chamber where she had made her discovery, Rebecca was standing alone among the carved stones, her headlamp beam playing across empty shadows, her face pale with shock and her hands trembling as she tried to explain what she had encountered. James saw the chambers, the symbols, the evidence of ancient habitation, but he saw no sign of the pale inhabitants that Rebecca described with such vivid detail and obvious terror. The Cherokee had legends about them, the moon-eyed people, pale dwellers who had lived in the mountains long before the first Cherokee ancestors arrived from the north, beings who could not tolerate sunlight and had retreated underground when the surface world became too dangerous for their kind. According to the oral traditions that tribal elders still maintained, the moon-eyed people had been the original inhabitants of the southern Appalachians, a race of beings who had possessed advanced knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering, but who had gradually withdrawn from contact with the surface world as human populations increased, and their ancient territories were invaded by newcomers who did not understand or respect the old agreements that had allowed different peoples to share the mountain regions. The legends spoke of them as neither fully human nor entirely spirit entities that existed in the borderland between the physical and supernatural worlds, capable of interacting with ordinary humans, but fundamentally different in their nature and their relationship to time, space, and the natural forces that governed the mountain ecosystem. Rebecca's team documented everything they could during their remaining time in the cave system, taking hundreds of photographs and making detailed measurements of the chambers and their mysterious symbols. But their work was cut short on the fourth day, when James vanished during his assigned night shift in the deepest sections of the cave complex. The team searched for him throughout the following day, calling his name and exploring every passage they had mapped. But there was no sign of him anywhere in the sections of the cave they had already explored, and the passages that led deeper into the mountain were too dangerous to navigate without proper backup and additional equipment. They found James 3 days later, wandering confused and disoriented through the forest above the cave entrance, with no memory of how he had gotten there and strange pale marks on his arms that looked like handprints, not human handprints, but prints made by hands with too many fingers, fingers that were too long and too thin to belong to any normal person. James's memory of his time in the cave was completely gone, wiped clean as if someone had carefully edited his experiences to remove any trace of what he had encountered in those deeper passages. But he reported strange dreams for months afterward, dreams of pale faces watching him from the darkness, of voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization, of underground cities that stretched for miles beneath the Appalachian Mountains, populated by beings who had been old when the world was young and who were still waiting patiently for their time to return to the surface world. The cave entrance was sealed by what authorities called a natural rockslide the following week, though local Cherokee elders nodded knowingly when asked about the closure and quietly expressed their approval that some boundaries were finally being respected again. Rebecca still has the photographs she took in those chambers, images that show the sophisticated stonework and the mysterious symbol systems, but somehow never quite capture the pale figures she swears were moving in the shadows just beyond her camera's range. And she still has nightmares about those reflecting eyes and the sound of whispers echoing through tunnels that officially don't exist. Voices speaking in a language that her mind couldn't understand, but that her soul, somehow, recognized as older than human memory, older than the mountains themselves. Story 6. The Bell Witch returns. The Henderson family thought they had found the perfect rural retreat when they purchased the old farmhouse in Adams, Tennessee, in 2018, drawn by the reasonable price, the scenic location, and the property's rich historical significance, but they had no idea that they were about to become the latest chapter in a supernatural saga that had been terrorizing the region for over 2 centuries. Mark and Susan Henderson, along with their 12-year-old daughter Emma, had been looking for a quieter lifestyle away from the urban chaos of Nashville, when they discovered the 1800s-era farmhouse sitting on 40 acres of rolling countryside. That seemed like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. The real estate agent, a cheerful woman named Carol Brennan, had mentioned some local folklore associated with the property during their initial tours, dismissing it with the kind of practiced laugh that suggested she had dealt with superstitious buyers before and wasn't about to let old stories interfere with a potential sale. The house itself was structurally sound despite its age, with original hardwood floors, hand-hewn ceiling beams, and the kind of authentic architectural details that modern construction couldn't replicate. All offered at a price that seemed almost too good to be true for such a prime piece of Tennessee real estate. For the first month after they moved in, everything was exactly what the Henderson family had hoped. 4 peaceful mornings with coffee on the wraparound porch, evenings spent reading by the fireplace, and weekend projects that slowly transformed the old farmhouse into their dream home. Emma adapted quickly to rural life, exploring the wooded areas around their property and making friends with the neighbors' horses, showing none of the resistance to country living that Mark and Susan had feared she might display after spending her entire life in the city. It was toward the end of October, as the autumn leaves reached their peak colors and the mountain air carried the first hints of approaching winter, that the disturbances began with what seemed like perfectly normal sounds that gradually revealed themselves to be anything but ordinary. The knocking started as subtle taps that could easily have been mistaken for the normal settling sounds of an old house adjusting to temperature changes. But as the nights grew longer and colder, the sounds became more deliberate and rhythmic, random creaking and popping, but purposeful knocking that moved through the walls of the house like someone walking inside the structure itself, following pathways that corresponded to no plumbing or electrical systems that existed in the buildings. Blueprints. The knocking followed a pattern that became increasingly complex over the course of several weeks, starting with simple sequences of 3 or 4 taps and gradually evolving into elaborate rhythmic compositions that seemed to respond to the family's daily activities and conversations, as if whatever was making the sounds was learning about their habits and preferences through careful observation. When Mark tried to track down the source of the knocking by following it through the house, the sounds would move faster than he could walk, staying always one room ahead of him, leading him through a maze of empty spaces where he found no evidence of what could be causing the disturbances. Furniture began moving during the night while the family slept. Subtle repositioning at first that could have been attributed to the house's uneven floors or the vibrations from the old heating system, but gradually becoming more dramatic and deliberate rearrangements that clearly required significant physical force. Kitchen chairs would be found stacked in the living room, the dining room table would be turned sideways and pushed against the wall, and Emma's bedroom furniture would be completely rearranged in configurations that seemed designed to create specific patterns or messages rather than random chaos. The entity seemed particularly focused on Emma, following her to school in the form of cold spots that made her teachers turn up the classroom thermostats and electronic malfunctions that caused computers and smartboards to display strange symbols instead of normal text or images. Emma began reporting conversations with what she called the lady in the walls, describing her invisible companion as a woman who spoke in an old-fashioned accent and knew details about the history of their house and property that Emma couldn't possibly have learned from any normal source. The conversations, according to Emma, were usually friendly and educational, with the entity sharing stories about previous residents of the farmhouse and offering advice about everything from where to find the best wild blackberries on their property to how to predict weather changes by watching the behavior of local birds and animals. But there were also disturbing elements to these conversations that made Mark and Susan increasingly concerned about their daughter's mental health and safety. The entity apparently knew intimate details about Emma's personal thoughts and fears, could predict her actions and reactions with uncanny accuracy, and occasionally made comments about the others who came before that suggested a comprehensive knowledge of every family that had ever lived in the house, including details about their private lives that should have died with them decades or centuries ago. When the Henderson family began researching their property's history at the local library and historical society, they discovered that their seemingly peaceful farmhouse sat on land that had once been owned by the Bell family, the same family that had been tormented by the infamous Bell Witch in the early 1800s, a supernatural entity that had become one of the most well-documented cases of poltergeist activity in American history. Investigated by everyone from local ministers to future President Andrew Jackson, all of whom had left written testimonies about the reality and malevolence of the supernatural forces that had plagued the Bell household for over 4 years. Local historian Dr. Patricia Moore, a retired university professor who had spent decades studying the Bell Witch phenomenon, explained to the Henderson family that the entity had never truly left the area, despite popular assumptions about its disappearance following the death of John Bell in 1820, but had instead entered periods of dormancy that could last for decades at a time, before manifesting again when conditions were favorable and new families took up residence on the original Bell property. Dr. Moore's research suggested that the entity fed on emotional energy generated by family dynamics, particularly the psychological development of adolescent children, which explained why Emma had become the primary focus of the supernatural activity and why the disturbances had intensified. As she entered puberty and began experiencing the hormonal and emotional changes associated with becoming a teenager, the harassment escalated dramatically during the winter months when objects began flying across rooms with no apparent source of propulsion. Dishes and glassware shattered spontaneously in their cabinets, and Emma started speaking in voices that weren't her own, sometimes the voice of an elderly woman with a thick southern accent, sometimes the voice of a young child speaking in archaic English, and occasionally voices that seemed to belong to multiple people speaking in perfect unison, about historical events that had occurred decades before Emma was born. The most disturbing incidents involved Emma reciting detailed information about previous residents of the house, including their full names, birth and death dates, details about their personal relationships and family scandals, and descriptions of how they had died, information that was later verified by historical records that Emma couldn't possibly have accessed through normal means. The family contacted paranormal investigators from Vanderbilt University who spent several weeks documenting the phenomena with scientific instruments, recording unexplained electromagnetic readings that spiked in correlation with the supernatural events, temperature fluctuations that followed no natural patterns, and audio recordings that captured the sound of a woman's voice saying, "I never left," in rooms that were verified to be empty of human occupants at the time. The recordings were made. The investigators' final report, filed with the Tennessee Historical Commission, concluded that the Henderson family was experiencing legitimate supernatural phenomena that matched historical accounts of the original Bell Witch manifestations with remarkable accuracy, suggesting that the same entity responsible for the 19th century incidents had indeed returned to continue its activities in the location where it had first gained power over human victims. The Henderson family made the difficult decision to move out after 6 months of escalating supernatural harassment, selling the property at a substantial financial loss to a buyer who claimed to be unaware of its supernatural reputation, but who had the house demolished within weeks of taking possession, as if eliminating the physical structure where the entity had focused its activities might somehow break the cycle of haunting that had persisted for over 2 centuries. The house has remained empty since the demolition, just an overgrown foundation hidden among the trees, but neighbors continue to report seeing lights where no lights should be and hearing the sound of knocking echoing across the fields on quiet nights when the wind is still and the moon is dark, suggesting that some supernatural forces are tied not to buildings or structures but to the land itself, waiting patiently for the next family to discover that some bargains are too good to be true because they come with hidden costs that no amount of money can ever fully pay. Story 7. The Mothman's Warning. Construction worker Jake Phillips had been driving the same route home from his job site for over 3 years when he encountered the creature perched on the bridge that November night in 2017, but nothing in his experience working on dangerous construction projects throughout the Appalachian region had prepared him for the moment when he realized that some warnings come from sources that exist outside the normal world of human understanding and natural phenomena. Jake was finishing up a late shift on the renovation of an old railroad trestle that carried freight trains through a particularly remote section of West Virginia coal country, work that required him to drive 20 miles of winding mountain roads to get from the job site back to his home in Charleston, a journey that took him through some of the most isolated and sparsely populated terrain in the eastern United States. The work itself was dangerous and demanding, requiring him to spend his days suspended high above rocky gorges while repairing steel beams and replacing deteriorated concrete. But Jake had been doing this kind of specialized construction work for most of his adult life and had developed the kind of casual confidence that comes from years of successful experience in higher risk situations. On this particular evening, Jake was running later than usual because of complications with a crane that had malfunctioned during the afternoon shift, forcing his crew to spend extra hours securing their work area and ensuring that all equipment was properly stored for the night. Safety protocols that couldn't be rushed or abbreviated, regardless of how eager everyone was to get home to their families. The mountain roads were completely deserted as Jake made his way through the darkness, his truck's headlights carving a narrow tunnel of visibility through the dense forest that pressed close to both sides of the narrow highway, creating the kind of isolation that made drivers acutely aware of how far they were from any form of help or human contact. It was approaching midnight when Jake's headlights illuminated the creature standing motionless on the bridge that spanned Miller's Gorge, a steel and concrete structure that carried the highway over a rocky chasm where a mountain stream tumbled toward the valley floor 200 feet below. At first glance, Jake assumed he was looking at a large bird, perhaps a turkey vulture, or even a bald eagle silhouetted against the night sky. But as his truck drew closer and his headlights provided better illumination, he realized he was seeing something that defied every category his rational mind could provide. The creature stood nearly 7 feet tall, on legs that seemed too thin to support its massive body, with wings that were folded against its back, but clearly enormous even in their collapsed position, and a head that was shaped like no bird Jake had ever seen, more human than avian, but wrong in proportions that made his eyes water when he tried to focus on the details. What struck him most forcefully were the creature's eyes, not the small, dark eyes of a normal bird, but large, luminous orbs that glowed red like the taillights of a distant car, burning with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the windshield of his truck and look directly into his soul with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware and purposeful. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, man and creature stared at each other across the empty highway, Jake's truck idling in the middle of the bridge while the creature remained perfectly motionless except for the slow, rhythmic pulsing of its glowing red eyes, as if it were studying him with the same fascination and uncertainty that he was experiencing while trying to process what he was seeing. Then, without warning, the creature spread its wings a span that Jake later estimated at 10 to 12 feet and released a sound that he would never be able to forget or adequately describe to anyone who hadn't heard it firsthand. A vocalization that combined elements of a woman screaming in terror with a metallic shriek of machinery operating beyond its design limits. A sound that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and resonate directly in his bones and nervous system. The creature launched itself into the air with movements that seemed to violate the laws of physics Jake understood from watching normal birds take flight, rising vertically without the running start or wing flapping that large birds required, ascending into the darkness with complete silence, despite the massive displacement of air that its enormous wings should have created. Jake sat in his truck for several minutes after the creature disappeared, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel and tried to convince himself that fatigue and stress had caused him to hallucinate the entire encounter. But the rational explanations felt hollow and unconvincing compared to the vivid reality of what he had experienced. He drove home in a state of confusion and mounting dread that he couldn't explain, checking his rearview mirror obsessively for any sign that the creature was following him, but seeing nothing except the normal darkness of the mountain night. 3 days later, Jake called in sick to work for the first time in over 2 years, telling his supervisor that he was feeling unwell but unable to explain the sense of impending disaster that had settled over him, like a suffocating blanket. A feeling that something terrible was about to happen to him, or his co-workers, and that he needed to stay as far away from the job site as possible. That afternoon, the old railroad trestle his crew had been renovating collapsed during routine maintenance, a catastrophic failure that investigators later attributed to a previously undetected flaw in the original construction that had been weakened by decades of heavy train traffic and weather exposure. 2 of Jake's co-workers, men he had worked alongside for years, experienced professionals who followed all safety protocols and knew their jobs better than anyone, were killed instantly when the section of bridge they were inspecting gave way, without warning, sending them plummeting into Miller's Gorge along with several tons of twisted steel and broken concrete. Jake should have been working on that exact section of the bridge at the time of the collapse. following the same maintenance schedule that had put his coworkers in the path of disaster. But his inexplicable sick day had saved his life while failing to save the men who had taken his place on the work rotation. Local researchers familiar with Mothman sightings throughout West Virginia and the broader Appalachian region explained to Jake that his encounter fit the classic pattern of Mothman appearances that had been documented since the 1960s, when the creature first gained widespread attention following a series of sightings in Point Pleasant that preceded the collapse of the Silver Bridge and the deaths of 46 people in one of the most tragic infrastructure failures in American history. According to the researchers, the creature, whatever it actually was, seen to appear before disasters, as if trying to warn people away from danger. Though its warnings were cryptic and required interpretation rather than direct communication. Jake's encounter hadn't been isolated. Other construction workers had reported seeing glowing red eyes in the darkness around the job site during the weeks leading up to the collapse. And several had mentioned finding large, bird-like footprints in the mud around the work area, tracks that were too big to belong to any known species of bird native to the region, but matched the descriptions of prints found at other Mothman sighting locations throughout the Appalachian Mountains. The bridge collapse was officially ruled an engineering failure caused by metal fatigue and inadequate inspection procedures. But Jake knows that the truth is more complex and more disturbing than any official report could capture. That sometimes the mountains themselves send warnings to those who are willing to listen, and that there are forces in the ancient hills of Appalachia that exist outside human understanding, but are not necessarily hostile to human welfare. Entities that manifest in moments of crisis to offer cryptic guidance to those who have the wisdom to recognize their messages and the courage to act on information that comes from sources their rational minds cannot accept or explain. Story 8. The Forest That Calls Your Name. Amanda Foster had been hiking sections of the Appalachian Trail for over 5 years when she decided to tackle the challenging stretch near Mount Rogers in southwestern Virginia. A remote and demanding section of the trail that passed through some of the most pristine wilderness in the southern Appalachian Mountains. But nothing in her extensive hiking experience had prepared her for the moment when the forest itself seemed to reach out and try to claim her as its own through methods that exploited her deepest psychological vulnerabilities and most cherished memories. Amanda was an experienced solo hiker who had completed dozens of multi-day backpacking trips throughout the eastern United States. Someone who prided herself on her self-reliance and her ability to navigate challenging terrain using only map and compass, skills that had been tested and proven reliable on countless previous adventures in locations that ranged from the rocky peaks of New Hampshire to the swampy lowlands of Georgia. The Mount Rogers section of the trail was known for its spectacular views and diverse ecosystems, but also for its challenging terrain and unpredictable weather conditions that could change from pleasant hiking conditions to life-threatening storms with little warning, factors that attracted serious hikers like Amanda, who sought experiences that would test their skills and endurance against some of the most demanding natural environments on the East Coast. Amanda had been hiking for approximately 3 hours when she first heard her name being called from somewhere deep within the dense forest that pressed close to both sides of the narrow trail. A sound that initially seemed perfectly normal and explicable, just another hiker who had gotten separated from their group and was calling out for help or trying to re-establish contact with their companions. The voice was faint but clear, carrying through the forest air with the kind of acoustics that suggested it was coming from someone who was perhaps a quarter-mile away. Close enough to hear, but far enough to require some effort to locate the source, a distance that seemed reasonable for someone who had wandered off the main trail while exploring a side creek or investigating an interesting rock formation. Without hesitation, Amanda called back toward the voice, identifying herself and asking if the person needed assistance. Then began following what she thought was the sound of responses to her calls, leaving the marked trail to push through the dense undergrowth toward what she assumed was a fellow hiker in distress. The forest in this region was particularly thick and challenging to navigate. with dense stands of rhododendron and mountain laurel that formed nearly impenetrable barriers in some areas, forcing Amanda to search for natural corridors between the vegetation while trying to maintain her sense of direction and keep track of her route back to the main trail. As she moved deeper into the unmarked wilderness, the voice continued to call her name with increasing frequency and apparent urgency, always seeming to come from just ahead of her current position, leading her through a maze of natural obstacles that included fallen trees, rocky outcroppings, and steep-sided ravines that required careful navigation to cross safely. After approximately an hour of difficult bushwhacking, Amanda began to realize that something was fundamentally wrong with the situation she had gotten herself into. Starting with the growing recognition that the voice calling her name sounded exactly like her mother's voice, not similar to her mother's voice, but identical to it in every nuance of tone, accent, and emotional inflection. Despite the fact that her mother had been dead for 5 years, a victim of cancer who had spent her final weeks in a hospital bed hundreds of miles away from any mountain trail, the realization that she was following the voice of a dead woman through an increasingly dense and disorienting forest landscape filled Amanda with a terror that was deeper and more primitive than any fear she had experienced during her years of solo hiking, a fear that seemed to originate not just from her rational understanding that what she was experiencing was impossible, but from some ancestral knowledge that warned her she was in the presence of something that used familiar voices to lure the living into places from which they might never return. Amanda tried to retrace her steps back toward the main trail, but every path she followed seemed to lead her deeper into the forest rather than back toward the marked route she had abandoned. And the voice continued calling her name from multiple directions now, creating an echo effect that made it impossible to determine which direction might lead to safety and which might lead her further into whatever supernatural trap had been set for her among the ancient trees. The calling continued throughout the remainder of the afternoon, sometimes her mother's voice expressing concern for Amanda's safety and urging her to come home. Sometimes the voice of her ex-husband Mark, speaking in the gentle, encouraging tone he had used during their happier years together. And occasionally, the voices of childhood friends, whose names she hadn't thought about in decades, but whose vocal patterns were reproduced with perfect accuracy by whatever entity was manipulating her through her own memories and emotional attachments. As darkness began to fall, and Amanda realized that she was completely lost in a section of forest that bore no resemblance to any topographical features shown on her trail maps, the voices began to take on a more urgent and insistent quality, with multiple familiar voices calling her name simultaneously, and creating a chorus of concerned loved ones who seemed desperate to guide her toward some unknown destination deeper in the wilderness. Amanda made the decision to stop moving and wait for daylight rather than continue to follow voices that she now understood were leading her away from safety rather than toward it. And she spent the longest night of her life huddled against the massive trunk of an ancient oak tree, listening to the voices of everyone she had ever loved, calling her name from the darkness beyond her flashlight beam. Promises of safety and comfort mixed with threats of abandonment and accusations of betrayal that seemed designed to break down her psychological defenses and force her to abandon her position and follow the voices into whatever fate awaited her in the depths of the forest. At dawn, Amanda discovered that she was only 50 yards from the main trail, close enough that she should have been able to see the trail markers from her position against the oak tree. But somehow she had spent an entire night convinced that she was miles from safety and completely lost in unmarked wilderness. Park rangers who were familiar with that section of the trail later told Amanda that dozens of hikers had reported similar experiences in the Mount Rogers area, all describing voices of deceased loved ones calling them away from marked trails and into dense forest areas where search and rescue teams had found evidence of people who had wandered in circles for hours or days, before either finding their way back to safety or disappearing entirely into the mountain wilderness. Native American legends from the Cherokee and other southeastern tribes spoke of spirits that inhabited certain sections of forest, entities that could mimic familiar voices to lead travelers astray, trapping them forever in the spaces between. the world of the living and the world of the dead, feeding on the emotional energy generated by confusion, fear, and desperate longing for connection with deceased loved ones. The legends warned that such spirits were most active in places where the boundary between life and death had been weakened by tragedy or trauma. Locations where people had died violently or where the natural order had been disrupted by human activities that violated the spiritual ecology of the forest ecosystem. Amanda still hikes regularly throughout the Appalachian Mountains, but she never hikes alone anymore, and she has developed strict protocols for dealing with voices that call her name from areas outside her visual range. She never responds to such calls, never leaves marked trails to investigate mysterious sounds, and always carries emergency signaling devices that allow her to call for help if she becomes disoriented or loses her way. Most importantly, she has learned to recognize the difference between the normal sounds of the forest and the supernatural mimicry that uses her own emotional attachments against her, trusting her instincts when something feels wrong rather than allowing curiosity or the desire to help others override her survival instincts. Because she understands now that some voices in the wilderness are not calling for help but offering an invitation to join the countless others who answered similar calls and never found their way back to the world of the living. Story 9. The Melungeon Curse. When genealogy researcher David Mullins began investigating his Appalachian ancestry in the spring of 2019, he thought he was simply satisfying his curiosity about his family's roots and perhaps uncovering some interesting stories about pioneer life in the mountains, but his research would ultimately reveal a supernatural legacy that had been claiming the lives of Mullins' men for over a century and would force him to confront forces that existed outside the realm of historical records and DNA analysis. David was a retired college professor who had spent his career teaching American history at a small university in Tennessee, and his approach to genealogical research was methodical and scholarly, involving careful examination of census records, church registries, court documents, and other official sources that could provide verifiable information about his ancestors' lives and circumstances. His initial research proceeded normally, tracing his paternal lineage back through several generations of farmers and tradesmen who had lived in the mountainous regions of eastern Tennessee and southwestern Virginia. People who had led unremarkable lives that were typical of rural Appalachian families during the 19th and early 20th centuries. It wasn't until David began investigating his great-great-grandmother, a woman named Sarah Mullins, who appeared in census records but about whom very little biographical information seemed to exist, that he uncovered the first clues about his family's connection to one of the most mysterious and misunderstood populations in Appalachian history. Sarah Mullins, according to the fragmentary records David was able to locate, had been one of the Melungeon people members of a mixed race group that had lived in isolated mountain communities throughout the southeastern United States for centuries. People whose ethnic origins were disputed and whose social status had been ambiguous and often problematic in a region where racial categories were strictly defined and rigorously enforced by both law and custom. The Melungeons had been variously described as descendants of lost Portuguese sailors, escaped slaves, Native American refugees, or various combinations of these and other populations. But what made them particularly interesting to researchers like David was the persistent folklore that attributed supernatural abilities to certain Melungeon families. Stories about people who could predict weather changes, find lost objects, heal illnesses through folk remedies, and communicate with spirits of the dead. As David delved deeper into his family's Melungeon heritage, he began to notice disturbing patterns in the genealogical records that suggested his investigation was uncovering more than just historical curiosities about his ancestors' ethnic background and social circumstances. Every generation of Mullins' men, as far back as David could trace the family line, had died